Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive today. We're tackling a really interesting topic, um, the connection between binge eating and food addiction.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So we're going to be looking at some excerpts from a scientific paper called Binge Eating Disorder and Food Addiction. It's actually published on a U.S. government website.
Okay.
So don't worry, we're not going to get all super technical.
Right.
We're going to try to break this down and make it accessible and interesting for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. There are some really intriguing insights from the research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so let's just start with the basics. Like, what is binge eating disorder, or BED?
Hmm.
The DSM-IVTR, which is kind of like the Bible of mental health diagnosis,
Yeah.
right, lays out some specific criteria.
Right.
So what are some of the key features they highlight?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that BED is characterized by these recurring episodes of eating a large amount of food in a specific period of time.
Yep.
And it's marked by a feeling of being out of control during those episodes. So it's not simply enjoying a large meal.
Right.
It's really feeling this compulsion to eat even when you're not physically hungry.
Yeah. And the source also talks about the intense feelings of guilt or distress that come after these episodes.
Absolutely.
Like, really emphasizing that BED is a serious condition, right? It has like significant psychological implications. It's not just overeating every once in a while.
Right. Yeah, and what's I think particularly interesting is that the research actually points out some really interesting similarities between BE and substance dependence.
Okay, substance dependence, so like drug or alcohol addiction.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really interesting. So can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what are some of those similarities? The paper actually has this whole table comparing the two,
Yeah.
which I found pretty thought-provoking.
Yeah. No, it is. It's I mean, some of the key similarities are this diminished sense of control over your consumption. Continuing the behavior even though, there are negative consequences,
Hmm.
and having a really hard time cutting back.
Yeah, like there's a real pattern there. And it's not just like the behavior itself, like even, the source also points out links to impulsivity and mood disorders as shared characteristics.
Right.
And even shared triggers like cravings.
Yeah.
And negative affect. And just to clarify for listeners, negative affect is basically experiencing negative emotions like sadness, anxiety, irritability, those sorts of things.
Right.
So it seems like there are some really like fundamental similarities there.
Yeah, and that suggests there may be some common underlying mechanisms at play.
Okay.
So both BED and substance dependence could involve similar brain pathways and neurochemicals. For example, both conditions have been linked to changes in the dopamine system, which is involved in reward and motivation.
So are we saying that the research is suggesting that certain foods might actually be addictive? Like, is that what we're
Mhm.
getting at here?
Well, there's some really fascinating animal studies that are mentioned in the paper,
Ah.
where researchers gave rats access to highly palatable foods.
Okay, so like junk food for rats.
Yeah. You think about the kinds of foods that we humans tend to find really irresistible.
Yeah.
And what they observed is that these rats actually displayed binge-like behaviors,
Okay.
even to the point of enduring electric shocks to get to those tasty treats.
Wow. So they'd rather get zapped than miss out on their highly processed rat food.
Yeah, pretty much. So
Right.
that raises an interesting question. If rats are exhibiting these behaviors, could similar processes be at work in humans?
Right, right. And what might the implications be for how we understand like food and addiction?
It's definitely an important question. It is really important to remember that these are animal studies, so extrapolating those findings to humans is always a little complex. But the research does suggest that certain foods, particularly those that are highly processed, high in fat and sugar, might have addictive properties.
Right. And they also pointed out that those rats exhibited changes in their brains,
Mm.
similar to those seen in drug addiction.
Yeah.
Specifically, a decrease in the availability of dopamine D2 receptors.
Hmm.
And that's a type of receptor in the brain that's really crucial for the reward pathway.
Right.
So essentially, fewer of these receptors can lead to a dampened response to pleasure,
Right.
which might drive individuals to seek out more and more of that rewarding substance to kind of get the same level of satisfaction.
Exactly. And that brings up an important point.
Yeah.
How do scientists study this in humans? We can't hook people up to milkshake 5Es.
Right.
So how do they go about researching this complex phenomenon?
Yeah, how do they do that?
Well, they developed a tool called the Yale Food Addiction Scale,
Okay.
or YFAS for short. And it's basically they took the criteria that's used to diagnose substance dependence,
Okay.
but they adapted it to assess eating behaviors.
Oh, interesting. So they took the principles of addiction and applied them to food.
Exactly.
That's really fascinating. So what did they find? Like when they used this scale, did it actually show evidence of, food addiction in humans?
Well, in their initial validation studies, they found that the YFAS was indeed a reliable and valid measure of food addiction.
Okay.
And then they did a study with obese patients diagnosed with BED.
Yeah.
And they found that 57% of those patients met the criteria for food addiction.
57%. Wow. That's a pretty high percentage.
It is.
So over half the individuals with BED, could also be considered to have food addiction.
Right.
Does that mean that they're the same thing? Like, are BED and food addiction the same thing?
Yeah, that's an important question. And it's an important distinction to make. While there's significant overlap, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same thing. However, the study did find that those BED patients who met the YFAS criteria for food addiction were more likely to experience depression, negative affect, and more frequent binge eating episodes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay.
That makes sense. So it's
Yeah.
not just a label, like it's a measurable difference in like the severity and the impact of the condition.
Exactly.
Okay. So far we've been talking a lot about BED, but what about people who don't have BED?
Right.
Can they still experience food addiction?
That's a great question, and that's where another study that's mentioned in the paper comes in. And this study used fMRI,
Okay.
which stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging,
Okay.
to look at brain activity while people viewed images of food.
Okay, so they're literally peering into people's brains to see what's happening when they're exposed to like tempting food cues.
Exactly.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right, so what did they find?
Well, this study involved young women without eating disorders.
Okay.
They were shown pictures of milkshakes
Okay.
or water, and while their brain activity was being monitored,
Hmm.
and the researchers found that the women who scored high on the YFAS showed increased activity in brain regions associated with craving and reward when they looked at those milkshake pictures
Oh, wow.
compared to the water pictures.
So their brains were like lighting up in those areas associated with like pleasure and desire,
Right.
even though they weren't actually like consuming the milkshake.
Right.
It was just a picture.
That's pretty compelling evidence that like food cues can trigger a similar response in the brain as drug cues do in individuals with substance dependence.
Exactly. And these are areas of the brain like the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex.
Mm-hmm.
They play a key role in processing emotions and motivations.
Including, those related to reward and craving. So the increased activity in these areas suggests that even in the absence of a diagnosed eating disorder,
Yeah.
features of food addiction are linked to these measurable changes in brain activity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. So all of this is incredibly fascinating, but I'm wondering, like, how does this all connect to the bigger picture of obesity?
Right.
We know that obesity is a major public health concern.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing rising rates of BED as well.
Right.
Is there a connection between these trends?
There certainly is a strong connection between BED and obesity. Individuals with BED are at a much higher risk of developing obesity.
Yeah.
And the source material really highlights this link and points to the challenges in treating obesity,
Okay.
even when BED is addressed.
So even if someone like successfully manages their binge eating episodes through therapy,
Right.
they might still struggle with their weight.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. While cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short, is kind of the gold standard treatment for BED, and it can be very effective in reducing those binge eating episodes,
Yeah.
it doesn't consistently lead to significant weight loss.
Right. And CBT for BED focuses on helping individuals identify their triggers for binge eating,
Okay.
develop coping mechanisms to kind of manage those triggers,
Right.
and ultimately change their relationship with food. So it can be, it is very effective in reducing binge eating episodes,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't always address the underlying weight issues.
Yeah. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It seems like, we're dealing with this really complex interplay of like biological, psychological, and behavioral factors.
Absolutely.
And if we consider the possibility that certain foods could be addictive, it kind of raises even more questions about how we approach treatment and prevention.
Absolutely. And it brings us to, a somewhat controversial topic.
Yeah. Which is, the idea of kind of borrowing strategies from other public health campaigns,
Yes.
like
Yeah.
like the ones that were used to combat smoking, for example, and applying them to the food environment.
That's a pretty bold idea. Can you elaborate on what that might look like? The paper mentions this concept,
Sure.
but it doesn't really dive into the specifics too much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, essentially, it involves implementing policies that are aimed at reducing the consumption of highly processed foods
Okay.
that are thought to be potentially addictive.
Okay.
So this could include things like, imposing taxes on these foods,
Okay.
similar to, what we have on cigarettes and alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
or restricting advertising,
Right.
especially to children.
Yeah.
Some proponents have even suggested limiting the availability of these foods
Okay.
in certain settings, like schools, for instance.
So it's kind of like shifting the focus from individual willpower to creating a system that supports healthier choices.
Right.
So instead of just like relying on, individuals to resist temptation,
Right.
we're changing the environment to make those healthier choices more, I guess, more accessible and appealing.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, though, like, how effective would such policies actually be?
Yeah.
And wouldn't there be pushback from the food industry and
Yeah.
from consumers who enjoy those foods?
Absolutely. And those are all valid points.
Yeah.
The effectiveness of such policies is still being debated.
Hmm.
And there's certainly the potential for pushback, for sure. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah.
But the source does, point to the success of similar strategies
Okay.
in reducing smoking rates.
Mhm.
And it suggests that, applying those concepts to the food environment, could potentially help curb the obesity epidemic.
That's definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
But let's get back to treatment for a moment.
Sure.
We talked about CBT being, kind of the gold standard for BED.
Right.
But how does that apply to individuals who might also be struggling with food addiction?
Right. Well, that's where things get even more nuanced, right?
Yeah.
So while CBT for BED can be helpful, it doesn't, directly address the potential underlying mechanisms of addiction.
Right.
So some experts believe that we need to integrate interventions from other areas of addiction treatment
Okay.
to effectively address food addiction.
So like we might need to borrow from the playbook of like substance abuse treatment.
Exactly.
Should-
So for instance, motivational enhancement therapy, which focuses on increasing an individual's kind of internal motivation for change, could be helpful.
Yeah.
So instead of just dictating, what they should do, it helps individuals kind of explore their own reasons for wanting to change and build commitment to that change.
That sounds like a much more like empowering approach,
Right.
rather than just telling someone what they should or shouldn't eat.
Exactly. And then there's, contingency management,
Okay.
which uses positive reinforcement to encourage healthy behaviors.
Okay.
So, rewarding yourself, for sticking to your meal plan or for, using coping skills instead of giving into a binge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a much more positive approach than the typical shame and guilt that often surrounds eating disorders and weight issues.
Right, exactly. And the source also mentions the potential of adapting techniques like imaginal desensitization,
Okay.
which is used in the treatment of pathological gambling.
Okay.
And this involves repeated exposure to those craving-inducing cues
Yeah.
in a safe and controlled environment,
Yeah.
with the goal of gradually reducing the intensity of those cravings
Okay.
and the urge to engage in that problematic behavior.
So it's kind of like facing your fears,
Yeah.
but with food. Like you're gradually exposing yourself to those trigger foods in a controlled setting, so you learn to manage the cravings without giving in.
Precisely. And while there aren't any medications that are specifically designed to treat food addiction,
Okay.
some medications that are used for BED, like, certain antidepressants, might also be helpful in managing some of the symptoms.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. It seems like there's a lot of potential in exploring these various treatment approaches
Yeah,
and kind of adapting them to the unique challenges of food addiction.
absolutely.
But what about prevention? Like, is there anything we can do to prevent people from developing BED and food addiction in the first place?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, prevention is crucial. And a lot of the focus is on, early intervention
Right.
and addressing the societal factors that contribute to these conditions.
Okay.
So, we need to change the messages that we send about food and body image, especially to young people.
Yeah.
We need to create an environment that promotes healthy eating habits
Mm.
and makes it easier for people to access, nutritious, affordable food.
So it's not just about like individual choices. It's about creating a culture that supports healthy eating for everyone.
Exactly. And that involves, addressing things like food insecurity
Right.
and socioeconomic disparities that make it difficult for some people to access healthy food.
It seems like there's a real need for like a multi-pronged approach,
Absolutely.
one that tackles these issues from all angles,
Right.
biological, psychological, social, environmental.
I agree. We need a comprehensive strategy.
Yeah.
That involves, research, education, prevention programs, public policy initiatives. It's a complex issue
Yeah.
that really requires collaboration between, healthcare professionals, educators,
Mm.
policymakers,
Mm.
the community as a whole.
Yeah. This conversation has been so insightful. I feel like I'm walking away, feeling a lot more informed,
Good.
but also just like aware of how much more there is to learn
Right.
and explore about this topic. Um, what do you think are some of the key takeaways for our listeners so far?
Well, I think it's important to highlight the complexity of BED and food addiction.
Yeah.
These aren't simply issues of willpower or lack thereof.
Right.
There are real biological mechanisms involved.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still unraveling this intricate interplay between, genes, brain chemistry, and environmental factors.
And we've learned that CBT, while it's a valuable tool for treating BED, it might not be sufficient for addressing food addiction.
Right.
We need to consider integrating interventions from other areas of addiction treatment, like motivational enhancement therapy and contingency management.
Exactly. And we also need to think critically about, um, the potential of public health policies,
Mhm.
aimed at changing the food environment.
Mhm.
While those, policies are controversial,
Right.
they definitely warrant, further discussion and research.
I'm curious, from your perspective, like what are some of the most promising areas of research in this field? Like what are scientists really focusing on to deepen our understanding of BED and food addiction?
Well, I think one area that's getting a lot of attention is identifying specific biomarkers for food addiction.
Okay, biomarkers.
So if we can, pinpoint biological markers,
Yeah.
whether it's specific genes or brain activity patterns, we could potentially develop more targeted treatments
Okay.
and even identify individuals who might be at higher risk.
That's fascinating. It's like we're searching for like a biological signature of food addiction,
Exactly.
which could really revolutionize how we diagnose and treat these conditions.
Right. And another exciting avenue of research is exploring the gut-brain connection
Okay.
and its potential role in food addiction.
Okay, the gut-brain connection. So like the bacteria in our gut are talking to our brain.
Exactly. Yeah. We're learning that the bacteria in our gut can actually influence our brain function and behavior,
Wow.
including our eating habits.
That's amazing. So like the bacteria in our gut could be sending signals to our brain that are impacting our food cravings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if we can understand how this communication works, we might be able to develop therapies that actually target the gut microbiome
Okay.
to reduce cravings
Yeah.
and promote healthier eating patterns.
That's really fascinating. It's like it opens up a whole new frontier in our understanding of food and addiction. It
Yeah.
seems like, we're on the cusp of some major breakthroughs in this field.
I agree. I think the more we learn about the biological underpinnings of BED and food addiction, the closer we get to developing more effective
Yeah.
and personalized treatments.
Yeah. And as we continue to research and explore these complex issues,
Right.
I think it's crucial to keep the human element in focus. You know,
Absolutely.
these are just abstract concepts we're talking about. These are real people struggling with real challenges.
You're absolutely right. It's essential to approach these conditions with compassion, understanding, and a willingness to challenge those societal norms
Yeah.
that contribute to stigma and shame.
It's been a fascinating journey, like exploring this whole landscape of BED and food
It
addiction.
really has.
I'm kind of left with this sense of like hope,
Yeah.
but also a deeper awareness of like the challenges we face, both individually and as a society.
I agree. It's a topic that really makes you think about your own relationship with food,
Yeah.
and the messages that we all get about eating and body image.
Absolutely. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here,
Right.
I'd love to leave our listeners with some practical takeaways.
Yeah.
Like, what are some things people can do in their daily lives
Yeah.
to cultivate a healthier relationship with food,
Right.
regardless whether they struggle with BED or food addiction?
Well, I think, one of the most powerful things we can do is practice mindful eating.
Okay.
So that means, paying attention to your hunger and fullness cues,
Okay.
savoring each bite,
Mm-hmm.
eating without
Yeah.
distractions, really reconnecting with that sensory experience of eating and being present in the moment.
That's such a simple but like profound concept.
Yes.
It's so easy to just eat on autopilot.
It is, especially in our fast-paced world.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not even really tasting your food.
Right. Exactly. And I think another important step is to kind of cultivate this positive, balanced approach to food.
Right.
So instead of focusing on restriction and deprivation,
Yeah.
try to focus on nourishment and enjoyment.
Right.
Incorporate a variety of foods into your diet.
Mm.
Plenty of fruits, vegetables, whole grains,
Mm-hmm.
and allow yourself to enjoy those occasional treats in moderation.
Yeah, it's about finding that sweet spot between like nourishing your body and honoring your cravings.
Exactly.
And I imagine it's also important to be aware of those potential trigger foods
Oh, absolutely.
that we talked about, those like highly processed, super palatable foods
Right.
that can kind of hijack our brain's reward system.
Right. Yeah, and it's not about demonizing those foods,
Right.
but just being mindful of, how they make you feel
Yeah.
and whether they're, contributing to unhealthy patterns in your eating habits. So, if you notice that certain foods trigger cravings or lead to overeating,
Yeah.
it might be helpful to limit your exposure to them
Right.
or find, healthier alternatives that satisfy those cravings.
Yeah. It's about making conscious choices
Right.
that support our overall well-being.
Exactly.
And of course, if you're struggling with BD or food addiction,
Right.
it's so important to seek professional help.
Absolutely.
There are effective treatments available.
They're all.
You don't have to go through this alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And reaching out for support is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Yeah.
There are therapists, dietitians, other healthcare professionals who can provide, guidance and
Yeah.
support
Right.
on your journey to recovery.
And I think it's also important to, advocate for change on a societal level.
Absolutely.
We need to push for those public health initiatives
Yeah.
that we discussed, like taxes on sugary drinks, restrictions on advertising unhealthy foods to kids, increased access to affordable nutritious foods for everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree. We need to create an environment that really supports those healthy choices
Yeah.
and makes it easier for everyone to nourish their bodies without that constant bombardment of temptation.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. We've learned that BED and food addiction are complex issues
They are.
with biological, psychological, and societal dimensions.
Yeah.
They're not simply a matter of willpower. So let's challenge the stigma and shame
Yes.
that often surrounds these conditions. Let's advocate for more research, better treatments, and a more supportive environment for those who are struggling. And let's each do our part to cultivate a healthier and more mindful relationship with food, both for ourselves and for our communities.
Well said. It's a journey that we're all on together, and by fostering, understanding, compassion, and a commitment to positive change,
Yeah.
we can create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into BED and food addiction.
My pleasure.
We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Until next time, stay curious, stay
Stay
informed,
nourished.
and stay nourished.